Welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training, motor learning, and adaptive decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, to make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Scott Sievewright. Scott is the head coach and owner of Primal MKE, an innovative MMA gym in West Allis, Wisconsin. With over a decade of coaching experience, Scott is a thought leader in the field of skill acquisition and an advocate for ecological dynamics approach to training. At Primal MKE, Scott has cultivated a unique training environment that prioritizes live practice and athlete-led exploration over traditional drill-based methods. His gym stands out as one of the few in the MMA space dedicated entirely to this forward-thinking approach, fostering both competitive success and long-term athlete development. Scott's coaching philosophy is deeply rooted in the science of ecological psychology and the constraints-led approach, where he emphasizes the importance of perception-action coupling in building adaptive and resilient fighters. Through his popular podcast, the Primal MMA Coaching Podcast, which has amassed over 50,000 downloads, Scott has brought deep technical discussions about skill development to a global audience, making complex theories accessible to coaches and athletes alike. Scott is passionate about challenging the traditional paradigm in sports training and helping athletes unlock their full potential. His dedication to evidence-based coaching and long-term development has made him a sought-after speaker and collaborator in the combat sports and movement science communities. Beyond the gym, Scott is also exploring ways to support brain health in combat sports athletes through innovative supplements and proactive approaches. With a coaching style that blends scientific rigor, practical application, and a commitment to his athletes' personal journeys, Scott continues to push the boundaries of what effective coaching looks like in MMA and beyond. Well, Scott, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thank you for making the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you for the generous introduction. Maybe we can just wrap things up there.
Yeah, right. Well, Scott, so as I mentioned to you before we hit the record button, I've been following you for quite some time. I first came across you or became aware of you in a podcast that you did with Rob Gray. I think that was over almost 2 years ago now, or maybe even a little bit longer, where you spoke about how you you employ sort of an ecological dynamics constraints-led approach in your gym there at Primal MKE. And we'll talk about your gym a lot, I think, as we go through this podcast and what you do there. But for our listeners, Scott, why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey? How did you find yourself committed, as we said in your bio, to an ecological constraints-led approach to training? Talk to us about how that journey took place.
Yes, of course. So I think I come from this. It's a familiar story that many of us have. We came through a very traditional, dogmatic approach to learning any kind of sport or skill-based endeavor. I started coaching so I started martial arts fairly late, in my late 20s. I had a very short amateur career, call it career if you like, but very short amateur experience. And the writing was on the wall. I knew I could only go so far starting at that late age. So I started to, explore coaching. I got an opportunity to coach at a friend's gym, and I was wholly unqualified to do so. But, I've always been kind of curious, and I've always felt if I'm going to do something, I'm really going to do it right. So I was interested in being the best coach I could be. That took me back to school. I went back to school to do a coaching and athletic development degree. And actually, my first couple of years, I leaned into the information processing approach, which I wasn't even sure what it was. I didn't really know there was, of course, I knew there was science of learning, but I didn't really know much about the theory itself. So the first couple of years I was reading Richard Schmidt's book, Motor Learning and Performance, and I was quite heavily into that. However, there was always this kind of large disconnect from how I was coaching and what I was seeing appear in sparring or competition. So really, it was just my curiosity, and through college, which was valuable, especially for the kind of motivational and psychological side of athletic development. But it just sent me scurrying down lots of different rabbit holes, and I think I can credit my first kind of aha moment was coming across a YouTube account called Train Ugly, and that was by Trevor Reagan, and he does some really great informational content, and it was about block versus random practice. And I can't remember exactly where it went from there, but that was the first peel of the onion, so to speak. And I'm still peeling that damn onion, but it's been many layers in now. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. So maybe you used the term that may not be familiar to a lot of our law enforcement trainer audience. You said information processing approach. So for our trainers out there, like if you, because I think that there's like a contradistinction between two different approaches in motor learning and that training environment. We've got what you described, the information processing approach, and then we've got at the other end the ecological dynamics approach. So Scott, if you had say 5 minutes or so with a trainer, and you had to help them understand what is information processing versus ecological dynamics constraints-led approach, could you kind of wrap that up so we understand the distinction between those two?
Yeah, I'll try my best. So I think information processing, especially from our space now, it kind of gets beaten around a lot. That was a robust area of science, but I think in a nutshell, it assumes that we are able to, our brain is kind of a repository of techniques and movements that we're able to kind of call on when needed. Now, I want to preface this by a little bit of defense against the information processing. Eventually, they always, context is important, and the environmental context and the situational context in informational processing, but it tends to put brain front and center as this kind of puppeteer or controller of the body, which I think intuitively, I ask my students a lot at the gym, what controls the body, and 99 times out of 100, if they haven't heard my spiel, it's they'll say the brain. I then follow up and ask them about what's controlling the brain, and that's a more interesting discussion. But again, back to what information processing posits is that we're able to create these motor programs or motor patterns and call them as needed. We'll develop them over time. We'll get better at them as we do them on repetition. And of course, there's a big overlap between the ecological approach and information processing. But the fundamental assumptions is that the brain is this kind of controller or repository of motor programs. I don't think holds up quite well to scrutiny. And in comes the ecological dynamics. Now, if I had to put that in a nutshell, that kind of rejects the idea of the brain being the kind of CPU, so to speak. Doesn't disregard the brain as being very, very important, but rather it's an exploration and a study of how we as, I'll use the word organisms, but we can say people, humans, how we interact and how we behave in our environment. And they're inseparable. So while information processing says we have our brains inside our bodies and we pick up all this information and we get our bodies to do all these elaborate things and then we can plug and play them later, ecological dynamics kind of rejects that assumption and says, each and every behavior, each thought, each feeling, each action that we have is tightly linked to not only what our bodies are perceiving and acting upon, but also what the environmental context is. And these are very important distinctions, and it doesn't tell you how to coach. It doesn't really tell you how to, but it gives you some principles that you can play along with. Last thing I'll say about that, which I'm coming now, as I've been going down this deeper, exploring this space has been very liberating in a way, but it's been very humbling as well, because what it continues to tell us that humans, their environments, and what they're trying to do are enormously complex. And to think we have an answer for everyone in every situation is really folly. So it's liberating in the sense because it can really open doors for creativity as a coach and really, uniquely attend to the needs of each specific athlete in that environment. But I think it's also telling us, be careful, be careful. We don't really know what's going to happen if we do this. Don't always expect to get that.
Right, right. So, one of the when I have discussions with law enforcement trainers about ecological dynamics, and we inevitably go down this discussion, this rabbit hole about techniqueless types of training. And because typical, if we're teaching takedowns, for example, in law enforcement, it's heavily technique based. Hold like this, rotate like this, apply pressure here at the right time. If we're talking about firearms training, it's all a lot of biomechanics, and the arm like this, the position like this, and we just rep it because the perception is exactly what you said. Well, if we just rep it enough, we're just going to create this motor program that the brain will just spit out when it needs it. And so then when I begin talking to them about a techniqueless method of allowing our students to learn based on principles and goals rather than techniques, they almost don't have a category for even beginning to think about a techniqueless system. What is your experience with that? Like in the MMA and in the martial arts world, is there still sort of that bright battle line between people just really struggling to understand a techniqueless system, and what does that even look like?
Yeah, there is, and I don't think we've done the best job of maybe discussing this as people who are in the space and trying to communicate these ideas. I've probably died on a few hills. I really wish I hadn't when it comes to the so-called like techniqueless approach. However, I think when we just appreciate perhaps that there's better and worse ways to do things and achieve outcomes. But if it's the outcome that we are really focusing on, just say it's let's for example take your example of a takedown. The outcome we're looking for is destabilizing another human being against their will under resistance and getting them to the ground. Okay, so that is the outcome we're looking for. There's a myriad of ways to do it. There's a myriad of better and worse ways to do it. So does that feel like I'm sneaking the technique word back in? A little bit, because I said we'll play around these techniques, but what we kind of reject is there is one specific kind of textbook technique that we must learn, and we can adapt that to life circumstances. We kind of reject that from the ecological perspective, and we focus more on the how your behavior is it having the effect? Is it achieving the desired outcome? And I think whether it be law enforcement or any other sports, you can see a ton of variety in the way athletes move, unique to their bodies, unique to their situation, unique to the dynamics of whatever interaction they're in. So the more you try to hold down this word technique as being this idealized movement, it doesn't really hold up well to scrutiny. Although I will, again, as I said, I will concede that there are better and worse ways of doing things.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that that's something that's very well understood within the ecological dynamics camp, is that when we talk about more or less optimal movement solutions, and I think isn't that the role of the coach, though, is even though you may see your, let's say with the balance displacement example, you may see your student ultimately get to the right place and be successful, but as a coach you look and go, yeah, you were successful, but there were far more optimal ways of moving with more power, more efficiency. And then isn't that the role of the coach to help guide that student to explore different options, different solutions?
Well, the two words I just picked up on there are guide, right? So a guide to explore. So they're important words there to stress here, because traditionally there's been this prescriptive way, and there hasn't been a great deal of exploration. There's been trying to repurpose, or how would I say, achieve this ideal that the coach is looking for, and what the ecological approach does is it broadens that area of search, so the athlete is able to explore, actually make sense of how their own interpretation of the technique, so to speak. So again, I think it's unfair to say techniques are useless, or we don't care about techniques, or we don't believe they exist. I've been guilty of saying all these things, but rather I use them just as points of strategies and tactics, and just guiding their intention, how something might look and feel when they're trying to achieve this outcome.
Right. Guiding intention. I love that. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that. Why is that important to guide? Because their intention and attention, I've heard you use those phrases together before in previous podcasts. And I think you do a great job of explaining why it's so important as a coach. One of our main jobs is to help guide our students' attention and intention. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I'm fascinated by the word or the meaning of the term intention and intentionality. Anyway, I'm just really not sure what it is, where it resides, where it bubbles up from. From our perspective, from the embodied cognition perspective, is that your intentions ebb and flow. They arise depending on the context of the environment you're in. We go to a gym, we assume that we're going to be sparring, we go to competition, we're going to be fighting, whether you're in law enforcement. So your intentions are, I can't really speak to exactly where they come from. I think it's just all the complexity of the environment and how you're interacting in it and what you're trying to achieve for that day or in that moment. So when it comes back to how we might introduce a new tactic or strategy, then I think we're getting close to the line of maybe showing a technique or advocating for a certain way of doing things. But that's what I would suggest in guiding intention. Let's take the takedown example again, since we started that. We use the word invariance a little bit throughout ecological dynamics. Invariance, and I'm careful with that word because I think we throw it around a little too often, but invariants are something that are always present. It's a key feature of either the move or the technique that's always present. An invariant in a takedown would be one or a mixture of both two things, which would be removing the base of support or pushing the center of mass across the base of support. So the person would fall to the ground. Now, there's thousands of ways to do this, or many ways to do this, unlimited possibly, but we can start putting newer students in games where we work on these invariants, and we set up little games to let them experience the behavior of being able to either remove someone's base of support or push their center mass over their base of support. I know that sounds like a cop-out because, okay, I'm going to get around to showing them some ideas and whatnot, but that's basically how we view it, rather than having, say, a repertoire, a collection of techniques that we're going to teach through a curriculum.
Okay, great. So why don't you give us some actual practical examples? So I show up at Primal MKE, and you're going to teach me as a new student. You're going to put me in a learning environment where you want me to grasp the concepts of balance disruption, balance displacement. What would be an example of some of the drills and I'm careful with that. I've got to be careful with the word drill too, but I think you know what I mean. What would you do to help me learn about balance and balance disruption?
Well, that's interesting because I've catch myself using the word drills a lot, and I don't notice until sometimes I listen back. So I can relate there. So the destabilization or takedown, that's probably not a great example of how we onboard beginners, because what we found over the years, and we got rid of it pretty quickly, is we have to level up to that. The greatest injury risk in our sport and in our gym is falling awkwardly, and hurting knees and legs and stuff. So we actually wait till a little further down the line before we start introducing full takedowns. But what we might work on, and what we generally work on, like if you were to come in for a first day of one of our MMA foundation programs, we will just play around in that very simple space of moving around with a live partner, and you may be both trying to grab each other's front leg. And there's many different iterations of this. There's many different ways we can set this up. Why one side's trying to grab your leg and you're just trying to defend it. We can add some light punches to the shoulders and the torso to add to that. So there's many different iterations we can play of this game. But fundamentally, or foundationally, what they're learning is how to be able to close distance, level change, and connect to another human being. And that is a foundational skill that works right the way through to the highest levels of fighting. I had a recent guest on my podcast that said, he has his beginners really do the same thing as the advanced guys. They're just really shitty at it. And that encapsulates what we're trying to do. So we're playing the sport from the day one, but it's scaled down to a space where it can be manageable and not overwhelming for a brand new person, and ultimately it's much safer.
Right. Great. So when you say you're playing the sport from day one, what I take from that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but are you then saying that there is representativeness? So there, when we look at like the real world, the criterion environment, that playing the sport means that it's all coupled with some representativeness to what that would be like in the real world. Do I have that right? Correct me, expand on that.
No, I think you did. You're doing a better job of making it concise than I am. So let's just talk a little bit about representative. There's a representative learning design, which has quite a robust finding in the literature, is that the closer the training environment is like to the performance environment, will elicit the best gains of transfer. Now, I think regardless of who you speak to, people would probably acknowledge that, yeah? How we get there, how we get to that representative performance level is different. And what ecological dynamics is saying is, hey, we can't get there right away. We can maybe never. In fact, what I think ecological dynamics is giving us, and this will fold well onto law enforcement and actual competitive fighting, is I'm not sure we can ever quite get to the representative nature of the sport, but we can get closer to it. So what we do from day one, like you said, we're playing the whole game every day, is we're starting a very, very reduced in terms of complexity and risk. We are coming way down to the low end of the representative scale, but we're still trying to keep the authenticity of two human beings trying to figure out the same problem, if that makes sense. And over time, we're going to scale that up. But our kind of a cardinal rule is we rarely, if ever, we never really splitting that apart. So it's always some kind of live interaction you're getting within our gym.
Okay, great. And how do you deal with the reality in your gym, Scott, that you would have different levels of skill? So I can imagine it in a whole class that you're coaching, just like in a law enforcement class. If I have 12 or 14 or 16 students in my class, they're all at different levels of skill and ability. Some are much more adept at moving skillfully than others. So how do you maintain, because it is a fair kind of question that I get from law enforcement trainers that are concerned about, well, mostly about injury and training. But they want their more highly skilled performers to still be challenged, and yet not like overwhelm the newer learners so that they don't get crushed by complexity and risk injury. How do you approach that? How do you maintain representativeness with a full class and keep everybody moving forward safely and successfully?
Well, that's something I've come to kind of acknowledge in more recent months, is that and we can talk a little bit more about what the constraint-led approach is and how that offers maybe a more, or say maybe a more effective solution to help and develop someone. But yeah, you're right. We come in with maybe a group. Sometimes our classes are up to 50, right? I think what ecological dynamics does a better job of is reminding coaches that, and maybe the information processing does not concede this, or does not put enough value on this, that when, just say you get new recruits, I don't know how it works in law enforcement, you got a whole new class of new recruits, that perhaps the information processing approach would say, okay, well, each one have their own different intrinsic dynamics, they have different kind of levels of athleticism and whatnot, but they're really blank slates, right? And we're all going to go through this linear curriculum, and by the end, some will do better than others, but they'll pretty much know the same stuff. I think what the ecological approach is telling us that, hey, they're nowhere near starting off. It's not even close to the same starting lines. They each bring in like social, cultural baggage, emotional baggage, trauma. All these kind of things are giving you a very unique individual on day one. So that's reminded me in these bigger classes, it's not ideal, but I have to be more of a generalist. So I have to try and get that challenge point right. I'm not going to nail it for everyone in the class, but it can help broaden that sweet spot. So I'm at least capturing most of the students and the learners there are getting something out of it. Maybe too easy for some, maybe too difficult for the other, but I think whenever we're in a group setting, that's just inevitable.
Okay, and we will get in to the CLA constraints-led approach imminently here, and we'll have you talk about that. But as often happens when I interview a highly knowledgeable guest like yourself, is when you're talking, you will throw out, the guest will throw out phrases and terminology that is really important. And I just want to go back to something that you just said. You used two terms right after one another. You said challenge point and sweet spot. Challenge point and sweet spot, and those are two really important terms. So, what do you mean by helping your athletes find that or stay in that challenge point or that sweet spot for performance?
Yeah, so and thank you for that. And I'm trying to be a better communicator of these ideas, although the challenge point is pretty much what it says on the tin, right? We're looking for that kind of Goldilocks zone of challenge where it's not too difficult, but it's not too easy. So there's an element of novelty, of surprise, of stretch, of success and failure. Now, I hear percentages thrown around, 60%, 70%. To be quite honest, I don't know how valuable they are or how you could keep track of all these. But generally speaking, if I design a class and we have three kind of programs, we have our novice foundations, we have our more intermediate mixed levels, and we have more of our advanced classes. I'm trying to have the content and the activities in that class be at in that challenge point, and I'm hesitant to use the word point, in that challenge kind of range for the students that are in there. Now, once, perhaps later in the conversation, tell you how my team and athletes have developed. So they're at a stage now, they're very, very independent, they're very, very self-directed, and really they're kind of designing their own practice in many ways. But to circle back to your first one, yes, the challenge point hypothesis or challenge point framework was just an area of research that suggests that when learners are stretched appropriately, not too much, not too little, that will elicit the best gains in learning.
Okay, and do you find then that is largely because we often talk about the art and science of a great coach, of great coaching. Do you think that that challenge point range? I love how you describe that rather than a point, it's a challenge range. Do you think that it really comes down to the skill level of the coach to actually? Isn't it more of a feel? Like you said, you don't have a formula that you put something in and go, they're at 70%. It's like, isn't it like how well are they doing? How successful are they being? How much are they challenging themselves? Are they still motivated? Like, how do you as a coach, you're watching your people, what is the feeling or the perceptions that you get that I've got to take some pressure off or I can put more pressure on?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for that. So for me now, that's the craft of coaching, right? That's the craft of me. How can I get the most out of most people and lift the most learners in the room over a given session? And it is a challenge, yeah. My bandwidth's only so much that I can only pay attention to so many people. So generally, I'm just getting the vibe of the class. Sometimes I have to pull it back. Sometimes I have to abandon activities right away. But again, and I have these little quips I use myself. If one person's confused, it's probably them. If there's a bunch of people confused, it's most likely me. And I just play around with these kind of constraints, whether I kind of put my foot on and off the gas. But that's a work in progress. I think I get better at it, but I'm not just getting better at it. I think because I've been doing it for a longer time now. I think I'm getting to know the athletes on an individual level, and that's really important too. I think there's the sense in the community or the skill acquisition ecological community is that we've moved from the information processing, which was all kind of centered on the kind of the brain, yeah, and the task, and then as we've jumped to the more ecological approach, it's all about the environment. But we can't forget again about the actual human being here, who are incredibly complex, who they're motivated to come to the gym for different reasons. They've got different things going on in their life, so. That not only is the challenge point difficult from our perspective of setting the activities that you think are going to give them the best stretch, but who are they as people? Maybe they're just not that interested. Maybe it's just a hobby they're coming for. Maybe they're just doing this to clock out something maybe like in law enforcement. There's a course they've gone through. So it's tough, right? It's super complex. So how can we do our best as coaches to maybe get at least more of the people we may have missed from the old traditional approach? I don't think this is magic by any means. It's just, I think, probably a better, more fun, exciting way to do things for coaches.
Right, absolutely. So, you mentioned the constraints-led approach, or CLA, just a few moments ago. So why don't you talk to us about that? Two things, if you could, please, Scott. One, so describe for our audience. So, like, what does that even mean? What is a constraints-led approach? Number one, and then number two, how do you apply it in your gym there at Primal MKE?
Okay, so I'll get a couple of buzzwords out of the way, then I'll try and speak about it more normally. So, if we think of ourselves as systems within systems, so as human beings, we're these complex adaptive systems. That's what we are. We are embedded within complex environments with all sort of things going on, and when we're engaging with another human being, like in, say, a fight or an altercation on the streets, okay, so that's they all form a sense of constraint. So there's these systems interacting with each other, and all constraints are you think of them as guideposts or barriers or fences that the system will behave within. So give I'm trying to think of so all coaching. Sorry, Chris. All coaching, even the most, if someone's never picked up a coaching book, if they come from any kind of theoretical background, all coaching is constraining. Whenever you put in a rule or a task or a set of tactical intentions, or you take away from someone, or you ask them to do something, even that is a constraint on action. And all that's meaning is you are narrowing the amount of behaviors that are going to come out of that system. Just being in the gym is a constraint in many ways, because people come with an idea of what they're meant to do, how they're meant to behave in a gym and whatnot. So we're constantly, as we move around the world and behave, we're constantly constrained in countless ways. And what coaching is narrowing these constraints so you can elicit behaviors that you're looking for. And that's really what the constraints-led approach is. So the constraints-led approach also has, it's back through, generally it pairs on well to ecological dynamics, but for me, coaching has always been constraint-led.
Right.
That is
right.
just a synonym for coaching.
Right. Okay. And so, like, within that construct, though, what are the constraints that you can manipulate as a coach? You said you're changing constraints. So what is it that give us examples of that?
So if I'm looking for, say, let's go back so we can keep this into the like the beginners MMA one. Okay, so one of my constraints will be, one of my constraints right from the get go with beginners is they're not allowed to hit each other in the head, right? So that constrains that behavior. So it reduces risk for us. It allows them to start practicing in a way that they're not scared of getting hurt or injured. The constraint might be the constraint of the game might be the rules and the tactics of the game. You're allowed to punch each other or hit each other on the shoulder or the belly, and you have to grab their leg for 3 seconds. So within these constraints that I've put in, which are, again, constraints needn't be this kind of lofty esoteric word. It's just the rules or the expectations. The person's going to behave, and you're going to see outcomes that unless they're cheating or they're breaking the rules or breaking these constraints, you're going to see behaviors that fit within these constraints. So when we broaden it to coaching generally, and I love the idea of like a landscape of, and we can talk about affordances in a second, but a landscape of opportunities that your person or your fighter could come in, and there's all kinds of way a fight can go. That's a big wide landscape. So all constraints, if we can think about them like fences, we're going to fence off a little area of that landscape and let the person explore in there. And I like that analogy because it's helpful, it's easy to understand, but that's essentially what we're doing. Rather than the broad set of behaviors that could happen and might happen, we're just going to fence that off into, depending what we're trying to elicit, we're going to fence it off into an area where it's more likely that the behavior that we're looking for as coaches is going to come out.
Right. Okay. And as I understand it, there's like, I guess in the CLA sort of theory or construct, there's 3 separate constraints that the coach can manipulate or change to keep them within that fence line. So can you talk about what those are and give examples of how, like in your gym, where you've got maybe you're not so much. Maybe we could keep the conversation more, Scott, to your competitive MMA people, not
Sure.
so much your recreational fighters. Because in law
Hmm.
enforcement, we're not training recreational fighters. We're
Sure.
training cops to actually deal with real violent people on the street who want to turn their lights out. So, talk about, so how do you manipulate constraints in that environment with those students?
Yeah, and I like how because it's easier for me to talk about my environment, right? And I have to preface this. I spoke to you before. I really know little to nothing about law enforcement, but I think this pertains to the constraint thing, right? So I can't imagine the challenge you have as a law enforcement trainer, um, because of the complexity and the nature of law enforcement. I mean, even when we step in a cage, which is a highly dangerous, risky situation, we have there's constraints that we are afforded that law enforcement don't have. It's one on one. It's someone who is relative your own size and weight. There is, generally speaking, unified rules. No one's going to pull out a bat or a gun or anything. So again, these are all examples of more or less constraints, which is going to affect behavior and how you perform. So if you, sorry, Chris, if you just remind me the quick question again.
Yeah, so it was about those three different types of constraints within
Yeah.
the construct that you manipulate. Yeah.
Sure. So with the ecological approach or perspective, we always think there's this constant, uh, unbroken interaction between the person, what they're trying to achieve, and the environment. And so when we can constrain all of these at once, we can constrain more or less than other. And I'll give you some examples here. But that's what we
Okay.
mean
Yeah.
about
Great.
the kind of the triad of the triad of things that we can constrain. So perhaps the environment would be, let's say we have a cage, right? So we try and get the guys sparring and doing as much of their live work. It's all live work, but as much of their kind of live rounds and stuff in the cage. So they're getting used to the surrounding of the cage. One environmental factor we might bring in is we might bring in people to watch them. So now you've got that kind of spotlight effect, and that's covering, maybe bumping or have an effect on your kind of perceptual grip, what you're actually paying attention to. So that would be an example of an environmental. One of the tasks would be, okay, we could set rules around the game saying, listen, you need to get a takedown in this round or you've lost it. Something similar to that, or you need to get a finish. So again, that guides their intention to what they're trying to do. So that's an example of a task constraint. And then perhaps for the human or organismic constraint, we might say if someone's maybe say they're not throwing enough kicks or they're throwing too many kicks, we might say, okay, you're not allowed to kick, or you're only allowed 3 kicks. In that way, that's actually still more of the task and the tactics. For the organism, let me back up there. We could fatigue them.
Mm.
We could either have them doing several rounds against a fresh person, or we could fatigue them through burpees or squat jumps or even before the round. So they're now going in a little fatigued. That would be an example of constraining an athlete. So you can start to see now that it's almost an unlimited, exciting toolbox where, as a coach, you can just turn the knobs and pull the levers and try and get that optimum challenge point for that learner in that specific time.
Right. Okay. Great. I love that. And just in law enforcement, like one of the things that I will do to use constraints is I will, because a lot of our events take place in low light or no light environments
Mm-hmm.
where their vision is greatly impaired or maybe not available at all. So we'll have them actually um, spar or fight with their partner in a completely dark environment. So we take away that advantage of vision,
Mm-hmm.
or we'll constrain a limb because we'll say, well, your dominant limb, you've experienced a significant injury, which is limited mobility and power in that limb. So we'll restrain it, and they have to now solve the problem with that type of constraint. So I think we're doing kind of the same type of thing. But for me, Scott, the key is, and I like how you explained the cage and bringing in the people and all that, because that what I was taking away from that as you were talking is the reason you were doing all of that is because it was representative of what they will experience in a real cage match. Why does a ecological dynamics coach put their performers in pure darkness? Why do we limit mobility? All that stuff, because that is representative of what is likely going to occur in the real world. So I don't know about you, but I found when I started to look at the CLA, the constraints led approach, two things happened to me. One is I realized as a trainer, I was going, well, I've actually already been doing that to a great extent. I just didn't understand the construct. But once I understood that framework, it actually really helped me to even take my coaching to the next level.
Yeah, and so I think that just leans back to what we're saying. All coaching has always been constraint based, and all good coaches, regardless of the theoretical underpinnings, they know how to constrain the action. They know how to constrain practice to get the best out of their athletes. I think where the more radical side of an ecological dynamics approach is based on the theory of direct perception, right? Which we can talk a little bit about. I'm at a stage where I'm 99% on board with direct perception, but I do allow myself a little caveat, a little space to back up the truck. But really, what direct perception is saying is that we perceive the world directly, which means that we don't have to make inference, or we don't have to have, again, this set stored of motor programs. We are dealing with and we are acting upon the world directly. And so when we spoke initially about perception action coupling, rather than techniques that we teach in Primal, we are trying to develop perception action relationships and cultivate them from ground one, day one, all the way up to the first fight, if that's appropriate. But to go back to my little activity where they're we call it a little shootboxing game, where they're not allowed to hit each other in the head, they're kind of jockeying for position, and then they're shooting for that front leg. Okay, so that for me is an example of how we start to cultivate that perception action coupling. Now, what we tend to do in the more traditional approach is we would do that against an unresisting partner, or a partner that's not moving, or even worse, sometimes in isolation with no one standing in front of you. We'll kind of do the shadowy stuff, and what that's doing is that's violating the very, very grounded principle of perception action coupling and ecological dynamics. So that's why we never separate them. It's not because we're just zealous about this new thing that we've read. It's because it violates one of the underpinning assumptions. Now, the direct perception assumption, or whether perception is always direct, that's a larger debate that I'm probably not qualified to. They've been arguing about this for centuries, right? But I think the perception action coupling, as being a grounded fundamental principle, is one that I really, really respect, and try never to break that.
Right, and you mentioned affordances, Scott, and I think we should talk about that, because that's an important concept, around direct perception and affordances for action. So why don't you tell our audience, so what is an affordance? Why are they important? And then how does that fit within the CLA ECOD construct?
Well, I have a love-hate relationship with the word affordances. I really love it, and I see my life through affordances and managing affordances. But it's a word that gets kind of trashed, and we fight over and whatnot, and we're often accused of just throwing out buzzy technical words. The word was introduced, the word was made up actually by the kind of father of ecological psychology, which was James Gibson, and what he meant from by the affordances that we are embedded in this environment, and there's invitations or opportunities to act upon everywhere at all times. Now, that very much depends on what we intend to do. And so if I can give you an example here, I have my can of LaCroix here. That affords me the grasp ability, the pickup ability, and the drinkability. However, if I didn't like LaCroix, it might not offer the same affordance to me as a cold beer would at the moment. So affordances are invitations to act upon in our environment, but they're not just binary. They're very, very they're intricately linked with how we're feeling that day, what our intention is. Can we use it? Do we have other motives? So an affordance in a fighting sense, and that's what I try and speak to my students about, is especially maybe on the feet, is your partner punchable? Are they kickable? Is this leg grabbable? And they're far from buzzwords, but that's really what an affordance is: an invitation to act within your environment.
Okay. All right. An invitation to act. And in your world of MMA and in mine of law enforcement combat, those affordances may only be available for an extremely brief period of time, right? And so the ability then of your student to have, I often use the term game intelligence. I don't know if that's the right term or not, but I heard it once, and I kind of like it. Is the game intelligence or the experience to know immediately when that affordance presents itself, and then what a movement solution is going to be needed in that moment. And of course, those moments may only be milliseconds long, right? That affordance for action. So is that where the importance of like direct perception comes in, and the representativeness to create that high level of skill and the ability to read in your people?
Yes, and before we're going, I want to put an important note about affordances. Is they're uniquely linked to your own capability. So, like Chris, we've never met. We have different martial arts backgrounds, so I'm sure we'd pick up on a lot of similar affordances if we were standing in front of the same opponent. But that might not be the case. You might be a little taller than me. You might be a little faster than me. To the point that you've just had more experience than me, you're going to perceive affordances where I don't. So just to say there's an opportunity, and this is of course a violation that we make as instructors, just because we can see an opportunity does not mean that the fighter can see the opportunity. Now, they might not see that opportunity for a myriad of reasons again, but it might just be they either don't perceive it as being an opportunity, or they know that their bodies are just not able to do that. I see this all the time in UFC where commentators are saying, well, he should just throw this or he should just throw that.
Right.
Yeah, well, he's in there.
Yeah.
He's not throwing this and he's not throwing that because he intuitively feels that he can't. He's either not perceiving that affordance, or it's not an affordance that's exploitable in that state. And to your point about over time, we're going to get more sensitive and build these relationships. If we take affordance of what I think it really means, what it's trying to tell us, that affordance is neither objective or subjective. It's a relationship that you've built between yourself and the thing. And this is what we're trying to do as trainers. We're trying to make these affordances more perceivable. And over time, really what we're trying to do is detect, as detectives, not only pick up on these affordances and cultivate them with ourselves uniquely, but building the capacities and the capabilities to exploit them. So going back to affordances, it's very, very important to say they're very, very unique. While we all share them as human beings, because most of us that are doing the sport, 2 arms, 2 legs, we can move in roughly the same manner. So we'll have very similar affordances, but an important point to make is that they're very, very unique to the learner.
Okay, and so would that be tied then with self-organization as well? Because I'm thinking of like this affordances being unique to the individual student. This must be a strong argument again against the information processing, the whole linear approach, because if I've got a class of 12 or 14 students, and male and female, different sizes, different backgrounds, different biomechanics, different mobility and range of movement issues, in that rich milieu of the organism, the human being, every one of them is going to perceive affordances, like you said, differently. So how then, if we have an information processing approach where I just think I've gotten into your head this linear motor movement that's going to come out because it works for me, and I think that's one of the biggest sort of short-sightedness in law enforcement training, is the coach or the trainer who is an expert. They're highly skilled in what they are teaching, but the expectation is that they need to get their people moving in the way that the coach moves or the trainer moves. And I think more and more as I come to learn about the reality of ECOD and CLA. I think how wrongheaded that perspective is.
Well, we see as wrong-headed, and here's why too. Because I'm familiar with these kind of gyms and environments, and from all kind of sports, they're going to teach these kind of textbooks techniques, and this seems to me kind of folly in martial arts anyway. Why would you want a room of guys and girls who move the same way and do the same things? That's robbing that ecosystem of the very kind of novelty and the diversity that it needs to become very, very adaptable. So I kind of reject that flat out, and I'm always trying to encourage this their form of life, their personalities, their traits, their very unique intrinsic dynamics to express themselves in the problems that I give them. And you can I talk about this a lot. You know, I'm now at a stage now, Chris, is where I used to look at potential fighters or people who I thought, oh, they have it right. I used to think that through more of an aesthetics lens, through more of a technical lens, through more of a, say, physicality lens. I don't see it through that at all now. It's really their form of life. Who are they? Who are they as a person? Are they robust enough to go through the challenges of learning a very, very difficult, demanding sport and come out the other end successful? And so my criteria of who can probably achieve that and who can't is shifted greatly.
Right. Okay. So I've heard you speak before, Scott, about you use this phrase, you say authentic movement, and that's obviously very important to you. So what do you mean by having your people in an environment where they can move authentically, and how does that tie into this whole discussion around ecological dynamics?
Well, again, I think the authenticity can. I think that's apparent now when you can even see the personality of your fighters, right? Maybe it's a physical traits too. If I have a really short, squat fighter and a long, lanky fighter, they're gonna. It's kind of obvious they're going to express themselves in different ways. But not only that, they're just their traits, how they carry themselves, the confidence they have. These are all expressed in the movement that they bring to practice and they bring to the cage. So you have people who are just naturally more creative. You have people who are naturally more cautious. And so I think their style kind of picks them rather than the other way around, whether I'm getting that back to front or whatever. So when I talk about authenticity, it's really about I'm looking for these effectivities and these outcomes, and that's how I set the games in practice up for. And however they do that, as long as it's not malicious and it's not reckless, I really let them free to explore how best they can do it. Now we can share ideas and I can point out things that maybe are maladaptive or, hey, this might not work when someone's really trying to take your head off. But for the most part, I let them be authentic. And I try not to talk out both sides of my mouth there. So if I'm going to embrace creativity, authenticity, self-organization, just promoting effective outcomes, I'm going to stick to that. And I'm not going to jump back into the old camp, so to speak, and try and correct things or overcorrect things.
Yeah, right. No, that makes perfect sense. So we're coming up quickly on an hour already. There are a couple of important things that I wanted to touch on and allow you to talk also about anything that you want to talk about that you think might be important to get out. But you and it kind of tied, Scott, to something you said earlier. You said that, one of the constraints that I could use is not allowing my students to punch one another in the head. And I know that you run a very safe school at Primal MKE, and that head injuries and TBIs and things are something that you are very concerned about and serious about. But how do you then, so if representative design is so important for performance in the real world, because this is what I struggle with, Scott, and I need your guidance here, is cops are going to get punched in the head in the real world. They're going to get punched there hard, and they will need to punch their offenders in the head. So how do we get there? How do we maintain enough respect for the safety that we don't want to be injuring our people in training, and yet close that representativeness as much as we can, so that they can, the first time they experience getting an impact to the head is not in the real world, when that's the last place we want them to experience it for the first time. So help us. Am I the only one that struggles with this, or what's the?
No, that's my central problem, Chris. I was hoping you could answer that for me. So, right. So I take the consequences of chronic and acute brain trauma very seriously. Now, I have to admit, I can't talk about representativeness and being authentic and training how we're meant to perform, and then dial that back so much that it then becomes inauthentic, and I'm actually setting up my athletes for failure. So a couple of things there. I'll get so for beginners and hobbyists, if you're a hobbyist in this sport, if you're just doing it for fitness or whatever, there's really no need to be getting hit in the head. There's no upside to getting hit in the head at all.
Right.
Period. Okay.
Right.
So rather than talk about safety or inoculate my team members from damage and risk, we're gonna find novel ways to reduce that risk, and so that means we're, for the most part, in fact, almost exclusively, I don't tolerate any hard impacts, but we're always trying to get the speed of the strikes. Now, I know F equals MA, and you can only punch so fast when you're not creating force. And I don't want this to be a cop-out, Chris, but what we've worked really hard, and I definitely stress the word we because it's my team as well, we've worked very, very hard on the culture, our ecology of practice, where people, they understand that they're learning movement. They're cultivating perception-action relationships, and they're working on movement and agility. So if that's the actual end goal of practice, then walloping each other in the head and seeing how tough they are and how hard they can hit, that doesn't make as much sense to us. So the roundabout answer is you create a culture where your people have a duty of care for each other. Now, I don't develop fighters with no head contact and say, right, now your time of getting the cage, Jimmy. Not at all. We slowly build it up, but that took me time because they're once they come to a stage where they want to start introducing head contact, they're only going to go with people that they can trust, not to hurt them, and only when and if and when they demonstrate a good sense of control and discipline and care for the training partners, then we start to introduce head contact more frequently. But it's a tough question. I don't have the answer. I'm not sure I'll ever have the answer. My answer is what it is just now. If someone's hell-bent and they want to make this a career or go all the way, that's a different risk analysis than someone who's maybe a hobbyist or wants to be an amateur. So it's really an individual case-by-case basis. But I do believe, just from what I'm seeing, if you can work on the reads in the movement and get the speeds up to as fast as possible, then the forces and the impacts aren't that important and we can dial them down.
Right. Okay. And I guess there's ways to have our people learn to read those biomechanics and those attacks incoming, to be able to pick up on those cues at full speed without those contacts even go into the head. And I'm going to give a huge shout out to you here, Scott, because I did some R&D, and that means rip off and duplicate. Okay. I rip off and duplicate. You spoke in one of your earlier podcasts that I heard you with Rob Gray. You talked about this because you expressed that you were very concerned about deconstructing movements by making the speed so unrealistic that you destroyed the whole movement. Sure. So you created, I think you called it a ring the bell drill or something like that, that you helped. So because I think that's a great example here for what we're talking about, of keeping speeds up so they're realistic and they're meaningful, and keeping power so we're not destroying the person we're hitting. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, ringing the bell is an unfortunate choice of words in my sport because you don't want to be ringing each other's bells. But often for beginners now, I'll get them to imagine there's a little bell on the top or the inside of the shoulder, and this is what they're going to target. We have two different two different kinds of sparring at Primal. I'll have a lot of my guys doing non-head, even on the fight team, they'll do non-head contact sparring because it's a good chance for conditioning. It's a good chance for really working on their accuracy, and they can, go ham on below the chin. And so I think that's been paying dividends, because again, we can't get fully representative. Then there's that area of, well, we can be pretty representative, but this is when is this negligent and reckless?
Mm-hmm.
So I've dialed it back from there. So how often I creep into that space where it's a bit negligent and reckless is very infrequent. But it's not to say I will never do it, or I don't think there may be a time now and then. But to add on to that, if guys, I would say mostly guys here, but if the guys and girls who want to fight, then I see the opportunity of amateur fighting being the chance to pressure test themselves. We run at our gym, we're going in our 13th event of pancreation, which is MMA without head contact. So that's layering, again, not quite fully representative because they're not getting hit in the head. They're not very, very reduced risk of headshots. It does happen, but they have the crowd. They have the walkout music. Their girlfriend come to watch them. So this is these added layers how I try and be creative and get them kind of used to the pressure of competing with the reduced injury. So far, so good. When we started on this endeavor, I was kind of scoffed at. No one was really talking about this. You'll never make a fighter. You have to learn the basics, the fundamentals, blah, blah, blah. My fight team are doing very well this year. We actually lost the last couple of fights, but for the year, I think we're 32-4 for our wins. All came through this ecological space. We're also going to other shows, so it's not like we're not getting brought in as the A side. And I try and match them fairly. So it's definitely working. How far we can take it is another. How far can we take it without being fully representative in the gym is a valid question. But I'm eager to continue going with this and see where it goes. I'm not sure again if I answered your question fully, but
yeah, well, no, I do appreciate. I think what came through loud and clear there is the importance of the movement, the combat movement needs to be as realistic at speed as possible, because that is, if our goal as coaches is to allow our people to be able to detect those very briefly occurring affordances for action, then the speed needs to be representative of what it actually is going to be, right, in the real world.
Correct. And then, of course, if you add the forces on and the power and the forces and you remove the shin guards and stuff, it's very, very different. I know I didn't have a long career, but I know in fights you don't really feel that much anyway. There's just kind of adrenaline flowing through you and whatnot. But again, I think I made they say the easiest person to fool is yourself, and I could be doing that, but I don't believe we can get fully representative in the gym. So that gives me a little bit of reassurance that I don't need to constantly be trying to get up to this full level of representativeness, because it can't be recreated truly. And again, so far so good, it's working, and the guys have built a culture that I'm really, really proud with. And not only that, it follows on into their lives too. They start to take brain health and that a little bit more seriously. When other people come into the gym, they're all advocates for this way of sparring, and so I'm tremendously proud of that. Now, will the little shots add up over time? There's a case to be made for that. I'm not saying it's 100% safe.
Sure.
I'm saying I've found a balance that works for my gym, my aspirations, and my people.
Right. That's fantastic.
And sorry, Chris, I wanted to just circle back quickly, if you don't mind, because you mentioned self-organization. The people will throw out different principles of the ecological approach and whatnot, but the two that are very, very grounded for me are perception, action, coupling, and self-organization. Now, there's the difference between self-organization, which it's just fascinating to me. Now that I learn about self-organization and systems and how they organize themselves, from ant colonies to all. It's wonderful to watch it happen in real time. But there's two assumptions generally made. Information processing is that we're going to create these motor programs in the brain, and we're going to fire them off when we're ready to do so at will. Self-organization says no. The body is going to self-organize around a task, around an outcome that you're looking for, And over time, it's going to over time it's going to get better at that. It's going to get more fluid at that. It's going to synergize better around that. So there's an overlap there, right? That when we repeat things, we're going to get better at them. It's going to get more fluid. It's going to get more aesthetically pleasing. It's going to get more efficient. And both sides will say that it's an underpinning assumption. One is a motor program that's stored in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
One is we self-organize around a task. And I think these are that if you can just get these two things down as a trainer who's maybe excited to looking into this: perception, action, coupling, and self-organization. Direct perception, I'm mostly bought in, but we can leave that for the real eggheads.
Right. Okay. Wonderful. All right. Last question for you, Scott, and then I'll give you the last word on anything you want to say. Warm-ups. I've heard you talk about how you don't waste time with warm-ups. Like when you use representative design, it's everywhere, right? It's even in your warm-up, and that was a real takeaway for me because even though I've been really trying to dip my toe into the ECOD and constraints-led approach world when I do the training. I had really completely missed. It's like, wait a minute, I'm still doing this lame warm-up over here. That why am I wasting that time? So that was magic for me. Talk to us about how important it is that even in the warm-up, you have representative design, and give us an example of how you do that.
Sure. Well, I mean, and just to say, like a 6-minute warm up out of an hour's class is 10% of your development time, and I think that's that's a lot. And if you say all things being equal, and you have a group of athletes that are getting 10% more representative or actual skill work, I think that the compound effect of that can't be underestimated at all. We come from not sure how familiar you are with the Brazilian jiu-jitsu community, but it was a low hanging fruit to begin with. From the warm ups, they'll come in, they'll run around in circles, they'll do some high jumps, they'll do all these animal movements across the floor and that, and everyone's exhausted just in time to sit around and listen to the coach. So we just scale things down. I just turned 48. My warm up is I'll slap hands, bump fists, and I'll either start rolling or sparring right away. Doesn't mean we're going up to it. Doesn't mean we're redlining it. We're going to warm up by doing an aspect of the sport, which is great for beginners. Is perfect for this kind of way of warming up, because we might just have a game saying grappling. You got to try and get your hands. You got to try and lock your hands around your partner's leg or their torso, so they're both jockeying for that position. No one's getting taken down. It's something they completely understand. It's they don't need to know how and when and what and what's the best technique. They're intuitively hand fighting and looking for inside space and whatnot. And this is the way we do our warm-ups. And of course, as we progress through the different skill levels, these warm-ups will be a little bit more specific, a little bit more, I would say, skill focused, so to speak. But really, the warm-up's just starting off a little lighter.
Doing the same movements.
Just doing the same thing, yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. No, I think that for me, that's a low-hanging fruit. That's great. All right, Scott, we've been going for just over an hour. Anything burning in the back of your mind that you're like, I really want to get this out. I need to talk about this. Anything that you want to say about that?
All I'd like to say is, and I kind of think I prefaced this at the start, I don't know as much as I'd like to about the complexities of law enforcement, what you have to deal with, the rules, the regulations, the one-sidedness of your interactions. So I think you've got a very, very difficult job, Chris. And so I'm delighted that there's people like yourself and trainers like yourself at least trying to nudge the industry a little bit more to more authentic training, because at the end of the day, yes, we can get injured and people's dreams can get shattered here, but you're literally in the life or death business, and I have no idea how you do it. So kudos to you.
Well, thanks, Scott, and it's been great having you on. If our listeners want to reach out to you or they want to find out more about you, is there a way that you would prefer for them to get into contact with you? And I think you also have so talk to them about your Primal MMA podcast as well, and where can they go to find that?
Okay, well, thank you for that. Anyone can reach out to me. My email is scott@primalmke.com. I try and answer, not that I get too many, but if any coach reaches out, they're looking to dabble, I'm happy to, give any advice, maybe my shortcomings when I started it. If I can help them get there a little bit faster, I'm happy to do so. I actually just wound up the Primal podcast. For me, my grandfather always told me the biggest sin is to be boring, and I was starting to get a little bit bored of the conversations. I was just repeating myself on and on. So I might pick that up later, but that's the Primal MMA coaching podcast. Have lots of academics, sports scientists, coaches on there, all speaking about an ecological approach. I think there's, if you like that, I'm plugging, shameless plug to one of my friends here, Josh Peacock of the Combat Learning. So Josh and I started our podcast around the same time, and we have many of the same guests, but it's all more kind of academic space. Our endeavor was to, try and take some of this rich data and research from the shelves in the books and make it more manageable for day-to-day coaches. So I straddle right in the middle. No, I'm certainly not an academic. I'm more of a kind of pracademic. Yeah.
Right.
So that's
Yeah, you are a pracademic, and just for our listeners, Scott clearly doesn't like to blow his own horn, and that's understandable. But I've listened to probably the majority of his Primal MMA podcast episodes, and one thing you'll be greatly enriched by listening to those is Scott has a great way of taking the science around this approach, the ecological dynamics approach, and talking in his podcasts about the ways that is actually applied, because that's one of the things that us as trainers we really need to understand is not just the science about how, but the question is, or around this whole principle of ecological dynamics, but how do I actually apply that in my training? What does it look like? And Scott, you do a great job at doing that. So thank you for what you do and for your time here. I will put in the show notes the link to your Primal MMA podcast, as well as this Combat Learning podcast that you mentioned as well. So thanks for joining us on the Trainer's Bullpen today, Scott.
Oh, thank you very much. And I'm going to leave you one last quip, and I'm stealing this off Greg Souders, but if anyone who just want to dabble in this and maybe start making their own games, he talks about making tasks out of tactics. So if you have some kind of, even if it's a technique or an outcome or some kind of tactic or strategy that you're trying to develop there, go ahead and make a game out of it. We don't know. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't work, but that's how you get started. And once you get into the rhythm of designing games, it's such a fun way to coach. But thank you very much, Chris.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainer's Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.